Hello and welcome to Samuel's Fortress. I'm your host Kirill. During the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, the Czech journalist Vladimir Sis would be serving as a war correspondent in the Balkans. He would eventually become embedded within the Bulgarian army, specifically amongst Macedonian infantrymen. Many of these Macedonian infantrymen, along with other Bulgarian soldiers and civilians, would be captured by the Greek army during the Second Balkan War and would be sent as prisoners to the city of Salonika. Once in Salonika, they were boarded onto ships and sent to various Aegean islands where they were to be interned during the duration of the war. One of these ships was named Ekaterini and was sent to the island of Paleo Trikeri off the coast of Thessaly. Among the Bulgarian captives on the Ekaterini was Hristo Batangiev and Evlogi Svetiev. Hristo Batangiev was one of the 6 original founders of the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, and Evlogi Svetiev was the Bulgarian archimandrite in the city of Salonika. Svetiev was originally from the city of Bitola and was very active during the Bulgarian National Revival and was very active during the formation of the Bulgarian Exarchate Church. Svetiev and Batangiev, along with other Bulgarian captives, were thrown overboard into the Aegean Sea while the Ekaterini was making its way to Paleo Trikeri. After the war, many of the captives who were held at Paleo Trikeri returned home, but many did not. After the war, in May of 1914, Vladimir Sis went to Paleo Trikeri to investigate what occurred to the Bulgarians who never came home. This is his story.
I decided to visit Paleo Trikeri a long time ago, while I was still in Sofia, before I even arrived in Greece. And one day, when I was already in Volos, I announced my decision to the German consul. Of course, I hid from him the real purpose of my visit. I told him that I just wanted to visit the island, to see the monastery of the Virgin Mary and the surrounding area, where perhaps something would be found that would be of interest to an archaeologist or a philologist. The consul tried to dissuade me. Trikeri, he explained, was where the Bulgarian captives were taken. Many of them died, and the corpses were buried in shallow graves, and some even remained unburied. The island is now a breeding ground for cholera, and anyone who steps foot there exposes themselves to great danger. It was sound advice, but it failed to change my mind. My God, hundreds of graves, hundreds of unburied dead, unfortunate prisoners who died far from their homes. This is what I wanted to witness. On the evening of May 11th, against the advice of the kind consul, I rented a small sailboat, which by a strange coincidence bore the name of a famous martyr from the ancient Christian days. It was called Saint Barbara. Early the next day, before sunrise, I was at the port. A guard, still sleepy, appeared before me. "Where to, Trikeri?" "Yes, my friend, to Trikeri." "But why?" "Ask the German consul, he'll tell you," I said, a little rudely but jokingly. The guard, who did not appreciate my response, shook his head. "No, you're not allowed there." Immediately, one of the rowers raised the German tricolor flag. I had borrowed it from the consul, and I see now what an irresistible power and charm it had. It freed me from all suspicion and paved my way. The guard stepped back. He is a German, he probably thought. He is no Bulgarian. We departed. The wind was fair, and the boat with taut white sails swam swiftly. We came out of the bay, and behind us, Volos moved away and disappeared behind the fog and the blue morning mist. We were in the open sea, the quiet, endless, blissful southern sea. We traveled for a long time, but the wind weakened and the rowers grabbed their oars as I sat at the helm. 4 whole hours had passed, and finally 3 small islands with olive groves appeared before us. The eldest of the rowers told me, "Those are the small Trikeri Islands. Nobody lives there. The big one behind them, that is Old Trikeri. That's the one that we're going to. Look, the monastery is visible." "Is that the island where the Bulgarian prisoners were kept?" I asked naively. "Yes, sir. Many died there. You can still see their graves, but don't think that was all of them. Many were drowned, countless in fact." "Drowned?" "Of course, but they didn't jump into the sea on their own. We began throwing them overboard as soon as we left the port of Thessaloniki." "Why would you do that?" "What do you mean, why? They were Bulgarians, nothing more. 1,000 or 2,000 less Bulgarians, the fewer of them, the better for us. Our captain said, 'Come on, boys, let's see how well these Bulgarians know how to swim.' They wanted access to the sea, Well, let's let them have it. We deliberately stopped the steamer in the open sea, quite far from the shore. We began throwing the Bulgarians into the water. It was fun to watch, yes. Those who knew how to swim reached the shore, but those who didn't are at the bottom. You look at one of them, splashing with his arms, choking, and then suddenly he sinks and disappears, as if you threw a stone into the ocean. I shivered, deeply tormented from what I had just heard. However, I had to pretend that this cynical and shameless story of the Greek made little impression on me. I stared at the vast blue sea. Oh, how many unfortunate victims she has buried. But now, this foreign and distant sea seemed to have more mercy than the heirs of her ancient culture. In its bowels it had sheltered many and saved them from the endless torments which this sinister island had prepared for them. Now, somewhere deep, their bones rest, and the sea protects them as zealously and carefully as it has gathered them. In Volos, I learned that the sea had washed up several Bulgarian corpses in the vicinity of the town. I had asked about their graves, and the people pointed to the sea. They had tied heavy stones to the corpses and threw them back into the water. Yes, a good, boundless, and merciful sea. The wind died down, and the oars had been put to work. We progressed slowly. Where are we going to come ashore? The old Greek asked. On the other side of the strait, between the mainland and the island, it will be the best. There are also houses there and the church of St. Anna. There is also a small cafe. There, next to the sycamore tree, there is a good bay, but it is deserted. Regardless, we headed for the sycamore tree. I was glad that no one lived there and that my arrival would not attract any annoying attention. Moreover, here is where the prisoners were offloaded. I wanted to experience in my soul this sad baptismal procession of the martyrs of Trikeri from the very beginning. There was still a long way to go, and now the Greek rowers were talking about the war. The younger rowers served in the Larissa division during both wars. I asked him what he thought of the difference between the war with the Turks and the war with the Bulgarians. The sincere, naive, and simple peasant stated truthfully that, quote, with the Turks, it wasn't even a war. Only our feet hurt from walking. I fired my weapon less than a dozen times, that was all. But with the other war, sir, we were afraid. Nobody believed that we would win. Bulgarians are not Turks. We already knew that. When the Kailar division fought with the Bulgarians at Thessaloniki, an entire division against one company, we were at the edge of the city. We always expected the Bulgarians would suddenly appear from the north and would come to the aid of their own. We took no pleasure in that. Then, early the next morning, a message came. Our men had captured the Bulgarian garrison. We moved forward. The officers constantly assured us that the Bulgarians were few and that we would defeat them. They said we were 5 against 1. This encouraged us. But we saw the Bulgarians, and they held out for 3 days. I don't know if it's true, but after Kilkis and Doirani, the officers changed their stories. The Bulgarians, they said, are 5 times more than us. If this is true, then the glory belonged to us. They defeated the Turks, but we defeated them. Now that is no small feat, is it? Without realizing it, I began mocking these kind people. No greater heroes have ever existed, of course. Thessaloniki, Ioannina, what great victories, I said. Afterwards, 120,000 Greeks chased 300,000 Bulgarians all the way back to Sofia. Yes, if it weren't for the Treaty of Bucharest, you would have probably entered Sofia as well. The rowers looked at me joyfully and smiled. They believed me. And how could they not believe me, when in the same way the Greek writer Georgi Tsakopoulos mocks his compatriots? In his book, which was published this year, The Greek-Bulgarian War, he argues that the Bulgarians were several times more numerous, that they had better positions and stronger artillery. All victories were to be attributed only to the personal military virtues and bravery of the Greeks. If only this were true. Finally we arrived. A large fishing boat had dropped anchor in the bay. Fishermen rested on the shore, some wandering around gathering firewood. This is where the prisoners were offloaded, the old sailor said to me. Some had set up camp in the heights, but most of the camp was beyond, on the other side of the island. If you want, we can wait for you there with the boat. It will be closer to the monastery. I agreed. I stepped onto the shore, but after a short while, I remembered the first verse of Slavia by Kolara. Stop, O feet, for you are walking on sacred ground. Yes, these places are sacred. They are places blessed by the endless suffering and by the enormous sorrow of the ill-fated captives. Trikeri, who in Bulgaria does not know this name, an ominous word that fills the heart with blood and furrows the forehead with wrinkles of unbridled anger, and they thirst for revenge. Trikeri, an unimaginable hell created by malice and cruelty, a vast tomb. I walked along the shore. The first thing that caught my eye were round, shallow pits scattered all over the yellow sands of the shore. "These are wells that the Bulgarians dug here," explains the fisherman who drew water himself. "There is not a single spring on the island." I have known of these coastal wells since my early wanderings around the Aegean islands. The freshly dug pits initially collect quite good water, clear and clean, filtered from the ground. But gradually, the bitter, salty taste of this water returns, and the water from these wells not only does not quench the thirst, but inflames it even more. Only one option remains: to dig a new well. I drank some of the water, and it was disgusting and warm. Poor captives! They were forced to drink only this water because no other water source is available on the island. My boatmen did not want to go ashore. They were afraid of cholera. At least they wouldn't see me photographing the Bulgarian graves, and they wouldn't talk about it in Volos. I asked once more to be told where they would be waiting for me with the boat, and then I left. I passed through the heights where the camp of the first group of prisoners was located. There was nothing special to see here. Tattered and discarded multicolored rags, abandoned hearths, elongated pits that probably served as beds. That was all the evidence that proved that there had been a camp here. I stopped there for a very short period of time and then moved on. I did not need a guide. The island is small, and the monastery, standing on a lonely height, can be seen from almost all sides. In half an hour, I was at the open gates of the monastery. I entered. The monastery is large, with a wide, tiled courtyard, in the middle of which stands a new church. On both sides there stood tall, dark cypress trees. The surrounding buildings are old, 1 story tall, and closely nestled next to each other. 2 big dogs charged at me and blocked my way. I looked in vain for a man, a monk. Finally, on the ridge of the low buildings, an old woman appeared with a black silk veil on her head. The old woman called off the dogs and came downstairs. I told her I'd came to see the monastery. "There's not much to see here. The monastery is new," she replied. She took me to the church. When she saw that I had put a few drachmas in the donation jar, the old woman became friendlier and more talkative. She told me that she had lived in the monastery with another family, that her name was Malama, and that she had been here since last autumn. "When the Bulgarians were here," she continued, "our soldiers and their officer lived in the monastery, so I had to leave." "They say many Bulgarians died here." "Yes, if you would like, I will take you to their graves." I pretended not to care too much, and continued to look at the church. After touring the other buildings of the monastery and seeing everything, it was only then that I indifferently asked the grandmother if she wanted to take me to the graves of the captives. "But let's wait," I added. "Let me finish my coffee." "Let's go," I prompted her after a while, and we left. Malama is 70 years old, but she is still resilient and healthy. We descended quite quickly through the precipices of the opposite end of the heights where I came from. After a while, we came across the first traces of the camp. Several round and shallow trenches showed where the tents stood. "Our soldiers' tents were here," Malama explains. They of course chose the best place. It was under the shade and on high ground from where they could see the whole valley, open as in a palm of a hand. And there, in that valley, there was the Bulgarians' camp, Malama stated, pointing to the valley. A narrow, long valley, dotted with olive trees, sparse in some places, and in others there were whole groves. The valley stretches far and ends at the shore, where the crests of the waves whiten and the clear sky shines. Before my eyes stood the ominous place of death, in the silence that now reigns, as if bitter suffering and sorrow had frozen. How many unfortunate souls had been here? The Greek officially numbered them at 7,000. Half of them were not even soldiers. Most of them were Macedonian Bulgarians, village chiefs, awakened peasants, former komiti, teachers, priests, merchants, and guildsmen. There was even a woman, Malama told me. She said something bad to the soldiers when they took her husband, so they ended up scooping her along with him. The brave Evzones of King Constantine, they showed their courage to the defenseless and unarmed peasants. As if they had not gone far enough, they even captured a woman. And Europe, so sensitive and picky, a Europe that constantly accuses only Bulgarians of cruelty. Does Europe know about all of this? I walked slowly through the bleak, deserted camp. The trampled, dusty ground is littered with rags, torn shoes, and bent and rusted tin cans that may have been used as utensils and cookware. I picked up one of the cans and read a few Russian words on its label. Black Sea Factory Canned Preserves. These are the cans that fell into the hands of the Greeks from the warehouses at Siris and Demirhisar. This is the food with which they fed the captives. Some of the captives also had tents. I again saw several round and shallow trenches, but most of them slept in the open air. They made rectangular pits surrounded by earthen fence as protection from rainwater. I also found several fire pits dug into the ground. It is May now, and the sun burns relentlessly, hot and heavy. One wonders what it is like in the hot summer months, when the slightest breeze does not even blow, and the ground is hot, when the air is still, suffocating, too heavy to breathe. Thin olive trees do not provide much shade. There are orange and lemon trees here, but under their cool and dense shade lay the Greek soldiers, carefree, with full stomachs. I take it all in and begin to feel the suffering of these thousands of captives. During the day, deadly and unbearable heat, the endless, unfriendly, and foreign sea on all sides. At night, there is no peace from the thousands of mosquitoes. The captives went to bed and woke up hungry and thirsty. At first, as I heard in Volos, a steamer ship with bread came daily, but later it started coming less and less, and finally it hardly came at all. But the bread was not good either. In order to poison the meager morsels of the captives, the sailors threw the sacks of bread into the sea from the steamer. The captives, exhausted from hunger, threw themselves into the water to catch them and take them ashore. Bread from the worst flour, and soaked in salty and bitter seawater. It is no wonder why these unfortunate soldiers, upon their return from captivity, were so weak and feeble, leaning on sticks, barely being able to take a step, while others were carried on stretchers made of wool overcoats. I wonder how they were able to endure the suffering during their captivity at Trikeri at all. The Greeks themselves are surprised by this, as they believe that no Bulgarian would be able to survive the suffering at Trikeri. 5 months, 5 long months of hunger and thirst, sleepless nights, unspoken sadness, and dark, joyless uncertainty about the fate of their distant homeland. 5 months to feel not only how your own life is slowly fading and disappearing, but also that of a nation. All of this is beyond ordinary human strength. These unspeakable torments could only be endured by those who knew how to survive. Hunger, thirst, the most terrible deprivations and needs, the most painful mental anguish and suffering of the soul, all of this had given risen to serious diseases, even pandemics. More than 1,000 prisoners are said to have died. They died without medical attention, without comfort, and without hope. Some of them helped each other. A comrade helped his comrade. And when a sick man died after his sufferings and breathed his final breath, his comrades provided him one final honor. They dug a grave, buried him, and placed a simple wooden cross over him. Sad, silent rites, filled with tender brotherly love, rites performed far from home. The grief and sorrow perhaps was so great that there were not even tears in their dry, lifeless eyes. "Here is the cemetery," said Malama, gesturing towards the vast field. I stopped in my tracks. An entire forest of short wooden crosses stood in front of me. The graves were side by side. Some are surrounded by small stones collected from the valley, while others are lost and overgrown with weeds and bushes, and only a bent cross shows where the remains of some unfortunate man are buried. I bent down in front of the first cross and read, "Here rests Ivan Tonchev, a sergeant, died on September 8th, 1913. There is no information on where he is from or what regiment he is a part of." I move along. "Here rests Mincho Kinov, a corporal from the district of Stara Zagora. He died on September 15th, 1913. Graves, graves everywhere. I stopped at a cross with a more legible inscription. "Here rests a soldier from the 28th Regiment, Doncho Ivanov Kalamov, born in the town of Sopot, age 32, died on September 27th, 1913. However, those buried were not all soldiers. On many crosses I read the words, "Prisoner from Strumitsa," "Prisoner from Gevgelia," and so forth. Some crosses had no inscriptions. Perhaps they had been erased by the elements. Perhaps those who buried their comrades in the earth did not know how to write. Maybe no one knew the name of the deceased. On other crosses, only the first names were written: Kosta from Zarovo and Georgi from the town of Voden. Unfortunate exiles from the valleys of Vardar and Struma, and from all corners of Macedonia. And their names were not written in Greek or Serbian, but in simple and heartfelt Bulgarian words. I stopped in front of a cross, surprised and amused, the only cross made of stone. What grief and poignant patience must have been necessary for it to be carved. I read, Manol Stankov from Zanoge, Vratsa district. Was he a private, a non-commissioned officer, or something else? He could not have been an officer because the Bulgarian officers were taken to the Peloponnesian cities, but the person who worked so hard to carve the stone cross must have loved the deceased a great deal. The war in the Balkans was a colossal, brutal war. The nations that were the most heroic in the fight were also the saddest. What astonishingly tragic cases there were in this war. My God, in these boisterous regiments, several brothers fought side by side. Fathers fighting alongside their sons, teenagers who had left school. Manol Stankov, perhaps he was the only son of a father who was also a soldier on the front. Maybe together, under the shadow of their flag, they had seen more than one battle and more than one victory. And finally here, in this desert island far from home, the young boy, the fragile virgin life, is extinguished in his father's arms. Or maybe that is a little brother, loved and caressed, like the meek Benjamin in biblical legend, and he died at the arms of his older brother. Who knows? Who can answer me? But I feel that under this stone cross, carved carefully under a hail of tears, under it is someone very dear, very loved. A nation great in its heroism, in its misfortune, and in its sorrow. I stood quiet and mournful in front of this grave for a long time. From the inscription on the graves, I learned that most of the deaths occurred in August. This is very understandable, because this month is the hottest and most suffocating. The August sun in Greece simply kills. With great effort, I was able to persuade Malama to photograph me in the cemetery. I explained to her the easy handling of the device, but she hesitated for a long time and shook her head in distrust. You aren't a Bulgarian, are you? Why? I was just wondering, since you are inspecting everything so carefully. I am not a Bulgarian, sister, but both you and I are human, and these dead people were Christians as well. You are right. These poor people had children and elderly mothers. I looked in amusement at Malama, who was standing with her arms crossed. I read genuine sorrow and sympathy in her eyes. My gaze falls again on the half-broken crosses, and a happy thought arose in my mind. I took a gold Napoleon out of my pocket. This is for you, I told her. Go get a hammer and a hoe. We will repair some of the graves and crosses, and you will be in God's service. I am not sure if the former or the latter had the greatest effect on the grandmother, but she went back to the monastery very quickly, and I was left alone. Deep silence fell all around me. No sound could be heard, no birds singing, no rustling of trees. A forest of crooked wooden crosses. I stood amidst the sleepy, quiet stillness of the countless dead. I sat by a grave, and my eyes watered. Why hide it? And who, not only a Slav, but a man in general, could hold back his tears? I was here in front of the graves of all those heroes who had threw themselves into the whirlwind attacks near Lozengrad and Luleburgas, heroes who had entered the impregnable fort of Adrianople, and who, unstoppable and invincible, stood on the hills of Chitalja in front of Constantinople itself. And then, humiliating captivity and cruel death in a remote desert island. No, I would have no right to call myself a Slav if I remained indifferent. I was alone among heroes who are now in a deep slumber. It is difficult for me to describe the feelings that filled my soul. It was filled with indignation and anger. Greek history already has two Bulgar slayers. The first was named so because he cruelly blinded 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners near Belasica. The second claims to be a Bulgar slayer himself, not for some victories over a handful of tired soldiers from the Second Bulgarian Army, but for the fact that in Trikeri, in the most terrible of torments, thousands of Bulgarian prisoners died. Like his ancient predecessor, the new Paleo Logos made the same but very inglorious triumph. It is a pitiful nation, a nation whose cruelty is as great as its cunning, which has minted such a reputation for centuries. Ill-fated victims of its cruelty and its cunning, may you rest in peace. May you lay in rest away from your homeland, for neither your mothers, nor your wives, nor your children will ever come visit your graves. Your graves will become overgrown with bushes and weeds, with weak wooden crosses which will rot and fall, and in a year or two perhaps no one will be able to guess the place where such precious remains rest. But you will never be forgotten, and you will be avenged. I believe that this day will come, that it is perhaps very near. Malama returned, accompanied by another elderly woman who looked strange and was ridiculously dressed. I had to tip her too, and the two old women went to work immediately. They cleaned up the graves while I repaired the crosses. I put the removed and fallen crosses back in their places. I fastened them as tightly as I could, and I nailed the cross planks together. I repaired almost all of the damaged crosses. I paid the grandmothers and decided to get back to the sea, where the boat was waiting for me. The two women walked away. Malama promised to care for the graves. I found myself alone again. I walked around the graves once more and plucked as many flowers as I could find. I placed them on the graves and whispered, "Goodbye, ill-fated souls." Isn't this the first tender caress you have received? Aren't these the only words of your native language which you have heard? I headed toward the sea. All of a sudden, I came to a surprise and stopped. In the bushes in front of me stood two crosses, both without inscriptions. Two lonely graves. Who is lying here, and why are they separated from the rest? Maybe they died of cholera. Maybe the last wish of an intimate, loving couple. I crossed through the former camp. Its eastern edge borders a grove of lemon trees, and here, just as at the graves, there was a deep, dark silence. A thought came out of nowhere. These fresh, smiling lemon trees and these old, gray-cracked olive trees, they would know the sighs, prayers, and curses of the martyrs in this camp. There were those who lay in these pits only to wake up the next day for fresh torments. There were those who would have fallen asleep, not knowing whether they will wake up and see the new dawn. At the sound of this endless and dispassionate sea, with their eyes turned to the north, did those unfortunate souls die, whose fate had ordained them to succumb before their liberation. The survivors moved around the camp like silent ghosts, skinny and pale. In the shade of these olive trees, fathers mourned for their children, men for their wives, sons for their mothers and sisters. They had longed for their homes without knowing if even a single home had been left standing, unspoiled and undefiled by their enemies. I felt inexpressible sorrow. It seemed to me that I had been walking through the places where my own brothers had died of grief for their homeland. Yes, my brothers are really the ones who died here. I bow in honor of their deaths. On behalf of all those who know how to love their homeland and die for it, let us bow in honor of their deaths. Sleep silently, martyrs of Trikeri. The day will come when you shall be avenged. The earlier that day comes, the merrier. I believe this more now than at any other time. I believe this right here, at the place of your suffering. Yes, you will not be forgotten. Somewhere on the shores of the continent, fierce regiments will descend. You will recognize their flag, their trumpets, and their cheers of "Urrah!" Cruel but tender-loving warriors will arrive here, and on your lonely graves they will throw a handful of soil from your homeland. I also visited the abandoned church of St. George, in which, as Malama told me, the captives prayed. They prayed here and lit a candle in front of two icons on the small altar, seeking comfort and strength to meet the upcoming suffering. And this small abandoned church, consecrated with the prayers of so many martyrs, is it not a real and great Bulgarian sanctuary? The St. Barbara was waiting for me in the nearby bay. I summoned the sleeping rowers, and soon we departed. Behind us, this sinister island was moving further and further away, the island of the dead, the island of the suffering and sorrow. The sun was setting. Trikeri slowly disappeared in the distance, but in my memory, alas, she will never disappear.